Welcome to part 3 of this 4-part conversation series. I'm Norman Blissett, Managing Director of Gallinach and Chair of Cycle Park, and over this series I'll be in conversation with Paul Tuohy about how our respective charity boards and management teams have responded to the COVID crisis. Paul has just stepped down as CEO of national cycling charity Cycling UK and has many years of leading charities. In the third part, we discuss how to focus on the future at a time of crisis.
You mentioned there about some of the thinking that you did in your early days at Cycling UK about effectively strategic thinking about focusing on how do you expand your influence and so on. One of the things that I've experienced with COVID, coming back to kind of current times, is how difficult it can be for some organisations to think about the future and plan for the future at this time, and yet, if you look at the legal requirements of a director, so you're a charity trustee, you're a company director, or not. In the vast majority of cases, you will be. You've got legal duties, and one of the duties is to act in the long-term interests of your organisation. So actually, you're legally required to be making decisions now that have got a positive, or you believe will have a positive impact on your organisation in the future. So what's your experience in COVID, or maybe another kind of crisis situations, of how have you been able to get the organisation to be lifting its head and thinking strategically, as well as protecting the organisation in the kind of immediate crisis?
Well, I think the fascinating thing about your lead into that one, Norman, was the point you made about trustees understanding that they have an incredibly important role to play of leadership and governance, but fundamentally they're there not for themselves but for the cause that they exist. And I've seen that clash quite spectacularly in my career down the years, and that's why sometimes going back to the basics of who are we, what are we here for, is critically important. And I think with the Cyclist Touring Club, 140 years old, and a cycling club that got charitable status in 2012, and then I arrived in 2014, and I realised they were operating like a cycling club. Not like a charity for benefiting for cycling for all. So it was a bit inward looking, not outward looking. So talking, and even back then the board of trustees, because they were a charity in 2012, so they are now officially a board of trustees, they didn't call themselves that. And I was told not to call them trustees. They were called councillors. And so it was really, you could suddenly see the trying to do, you feel like you've sort of landed on a different planet, and that is it me that's wrong, because this is how, about this entire culture was not what, yet that was what I was employed to look at and do. And that's because there were some real modernisers on that board who knew that we needed to do that. But it did mean we had to, as a board, have some very open and honest conversations about what we're here for, and it kind of, it sort of troweled up the turf in a way that all these issues had to come out that were all lying down dormant. No one wanted to, and that's why that type of board about the nicey or the the angst one, it needed a bit of both of that to bring out those issues. And once those issues had come out, many of some incredibly dedicated, well-meaning board members decided to move on. And in came some new blood, in the same way it does in an executive. You need to do that. You really do need to do that, and the culture then changes in the way in which you need to go. So that was an interest, and it was also interesting with the whole dynamic of it from previous boards where I've been at, from more traditional charities where it was lords and ladies and sirs, and doors being open for you to fundraise and fundraising events and inviting people along and ka-chink, that sort of thing. And they didn't actually then do much more. They just saw that as their role. It was, some of it was, there's a wonderful phrase I remember I used to go to a few fundraising conventions, and a couple were in the States. And the American model is very, very direct. And there's a thing called the 3Gs, which I was curious about. You've got to have, if you're on the board, it's all about the 3Gs. So I thought, what's that? And it was very, very materialistic. It was give, get, or get off. So that's not the right way for me, as most people know, because there are people on boards who are there for their skill and experience. But it showed about the old-fashioned style board that's there to raise money to allow you to do the job, and the boards that are actually really ingrained in the strategy and are doing proper governance and holding you to account and making sure that it's being delivered, and that there is that appropriate growth where necessary or retraction where necessary, depending on circumstances.
Yeah, and I think it can go back to one of our earlier points about trustees understanding and charity boards understanding what they're there to do and what their purpose is. And I think that my experience, again, across a range of different organisations, is that some boards don't really understand that the vision and purpose of the charity is owned by the board. That's that's one of their responsibilities, that the strategy should be owned by the board, that the oversight and scrutiny of performance needs to be owned by the boards. And that's not to say that you don't delegate. You can delegate a lot of that stuff to the chief exec and the management team to do, but ultimately that's a board level responsibility, and as a board, it's board sign off. And I think that getting back to your point about some of the boards that are there perhaps more because of their influence and connections, that you then end up with a chief executive and a chief executive who's too powerful as well. And obviously there's significant risk in that as well. Just again thinking about strategy and focusing on the future. I heard I was on another webinar recently, and one of the panel members reminded us of because we were thinking about the future. The webinar was on focus on the future. He came up with this kind of lovely description of it. Is about the ability to be able to kind of think of scenarios and plan for different scenarios and be ready for different things happening to the best that you can be, whilst also accepting the words of the Doris Day song, "Que sera, sera," what will be, meaning that you don't know what's going to happen.
No, you can. This is really good.
you don't know what can happen.
You can plan it to death.
You plan it. You can prepare. The point is that you can understand your foundation. You think about where you want to get to, maybe a few different scenarios there. But also realizing that it's just really uncertain, and you just have to look at that and accept that.
I think that's a really, really strong point as a takeaway for people watching this. I think is that I've worked with people who are incredibly good planners. I've worked with people who you wouldn't even know what's going to happen in the next 15 minutes. So you've got, but actually, I quite like a bit of both of that. I actually, having these different personality types around you with different strengths and weaknesses is what makes a good team. My role is to then manage that and conduct it. But I think it's also been able to call time on things as well. There is I am much more a go with the flow, but I go with the flow knowing that there is a bit of planning. The key, there are certain sort of, you must know these things. How much money have you got in the bank? What happened? The D-Day scenario you said, we should all do that, because that gives real confidence. It's fantastic if the board are saying, can you go away and tell us what was the D-Day scenario being? What would we do? And all the rest of it. And you've got that parked up in the hope that it will never happen. But it actually feeds and gives confidence to think, actually, right, this is what we can actually do. And I think not being frightened of failure, the targets is a really interesting thing. I always had to work to targets in fundraising. When I was at the YMCA years ago, working in schools, I had to raise X thousands of pounds a year and so on. And you worked really, really hard to do that. And I'm pleased to say that I was able to do that, but you weren't paid any more for hitting it or not. So, you know, a target thing is like, why are you giving what? So what is, so if the purpose is then to achieve something more, well, that makes the target realistic in the non-profit world. But I'm not racing for a target as if I'm you know, a private sector sales rep, and I've got to sell X thousands of Cadbury's, and if I do, I'm going to get a nice bonus. We don't do that. People who work in this sector do it because they want to do the job. So I think it's really a curious thing about what then motivates people, and having that communication with them, and feedback. I was looking at one of your brilliant webinars before, Norman, about giving good feedback. And I think that's just something we don't do enough of. We've got to do more feedback. You know, if anyone's not had a look, you've got to check it out. I had a look at it before we jumped on here. And it really made me think, you know, was I giving enough feedback? Because it's a nudge, you know, it's a, but I remember when I was asked to pause on that one, doing the exercise and think, what was good feedback you had? So the best feedback I ever used to get was way back in one of my first jobs with the YMCA, where the director, who was way above my station as a local fundraiser in schools in Kent, but when you'd got a good result, and this is so age here before, but I would get a letter, a typed letter saying well done. I would often sometimes then get a phone call just saying just what Paul just heard about what's going on, and it raised you, because it doesn't cost much to do that. But the other thing was when we then did appraisals, the constructive way that they were able to look at my weaknesses, and the constructive way that they were able to do it in a way which then made you want to better yourself. And there's some real tactics and tricks around that, which I think a lot of people in management have lost. I don't think they're done. I think there's, you know, I hear horror stories of people who you say, well, what have you spoke to your manager about that? And say, well, you know, I have, or nothing happened. And you get, you know, these things we hear all the time in social circles, in work and life. And there's just not a need for it if we can just have that openness and transparency, because we're all, you know, working in the same organisation, we're all trying to achieve the same objectives, so we should all be looking to help each other. You know, as I say, horrible sporting analogies, my apologies if you're not very sporty, but you say you have to pass the ball. If you don't pass the ball, nothing moves. And that also cuts out the silos. You know, the amount of times when I'm working, I'm literally sometimes trying to join up the dots. Bob, go and have a talk to Sarah. She, oh right, okay. And you kind of think, why wasn't Bob talking to Sarah in the first place? Because she's in a different department. Look at the way you structure your organisational office space sometimes. That can really be freaky. Yeah. We actually compartmentalise people. That makes it then more difficult to deal with those issues. Maybe there's some mixing up that one could do there as well. Something for people to think about.
Yeah, I think, I mean, yeah, on that point about feedback, I think so what I say about, you know, people ask how do you give great feedback, then it is very much, there's a kind of expression, strategic approach is kind of overdone. Yeah. But it is about, I think for a lot of people, they think just about the here and now, and they're thinking about whether it's dealing with the COVID crisis, is it, you know, or, you know, I need to give a bit of feedback to someone, so I need to give a bit of feedback to someone. Actually, what you should be doing is you should be thinking about, you know, where is it that we're trying to get to? So it's coming back to purpose again. So they kind of focus on the future as an organisation. You know, what should always come back to your purpose, and then. Have you got the right culture and the right, and part of culture, as you're saying, is are the systems and the structures, do they enable that culture to exist? So, you know, just taking the feedback point, it's much easier to give feedback when feedback is just part of the way that people operate, and you can start that at the board. You can't be strategic as a board without being reflective. Without thinking and having a very open discussion about how things are going. Are they working well? What are the risks? Are we operating? So it's very reflective, and you're building up that culture of feedback that then you will try to flow through the organisation. But I like to the way that I like to. I mean, I mentioned the case Sarah.
line, which I thought was really good. It's also the phrase to be a realistic optimist as well. So you're positive about the future. That we're in the midst of the COVID crisis. There have been crises before, and there's always a recovery. So there is going to be a recovery. So we can be positive about that. We don't know what it's going to look like yet. So you can be optimistic, but you've got to be realistic. And that part of being realistic is what we've been talking about really understanding how strong your foundations are. Thinking about it at board level, do we have the right people on the board? Do we have the right culture? Are we asking the right questions? Have we got the right balance between support and challenge and so on?